Good afternoon and welcome to the closing plenary session of our water conference, co-hosted with the Heuermann Lecture, the last one of our 2018-2019 academic school year. We have a great group here in the room, in the auditorium, and we are streaming live, and a special treat today, also viewing live on NET. It is my pleasure. My name is Mike Boehm. I am the Harlan Vice Chancellor of the Institute of Ag and Natural Resources here at UNL, and also the NU Vice President for Ag and Natural Resources, to welcome you and to introduce today's speaker. For those of you who are just joining us, we've had an amazing 2 days thinking about the issues and topics surrounding water and food security on a global scale, and thinking about, as we often do here in the Heuermann Lecture, how we are going to respond in the next 30 years to feed a world that goes from 7.5 billion to near 10 billion people, and to do so in a manner that takes care of our precious natural resources, our soil, our air, and our water. And we've enjoyed every minute of the last 2 days. We had 350 participants from 15 different countries around the globe. We've had students engaged in their learning. We've had professors from universities across the globe. We've had the members of the World Bank, from industry partners, from NGOs, from other governments. It's just been a fantastic 2 days, and so we're excited that you're here joining us. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Rosegrant as our Heuermann Lecturer at this closing plenary session for the 2019 Water for Food Global Conference. The Heuermann Lectures are made possible through a generous gift by Keith and Norma Heuermann. Keith and his family are here. Keith, would you mind standing so that we could recognize you? The Heuermann Lectures are intended to bring together some of the best minds here in Nebraska and from around the world to explore complex issues related to food, fuel, feed, and fiber production, the resilience of our natural ecosystems, and the harmony of producing more food, fuel, feed, and fiber, while also thinking about the communities, the individuals, the families, and the communities that are responsible for producing our food. The format for this evening's event will be similar to other Heuermann Lectures, but for those who are new to the forum, Mark will have roughly 45 minutes. I've talked with him, probably around 30 to 40 minutes worth of sharing his insights, and then we will have an open question and answer forum. If you're interested in asking a question, we ask that you move to the center aisle where there are microphones and just queue up and fire away. If you're online, you can send your questions to us using hashtag HLSeries, and we are monitoring that traffic, and we'll get the questions to Mark. So on to the main event. Mark knows a lot about water and food security. He has been leading efforts to improve water and food productivity throughout his long-standing career as a scientist and as an organizational leader. Mark is a research fellow emeritus with the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C., and has extensive experience in research and policy analysis in agriculture and economic development. He has led research on water resources and agricultural policy issues as they impact food security, rural livelihoods, and environmental resilience. He holds a doctorate in public policy from the University of Michigan and is the author or editor of 15 books and more than 100 peer-reviewed journal articles related to agricultural economics, water resources, and food policy analysis. Mark has won numerous awards He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and a fellow of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Rosegrant?
Thank you very much, Mike, for that very kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to address you in the Heuermann Lecture Day. It's a great honor to be here in Nebraska, and particularly for the occasion of this lecture. Let me start moving here. So what I'm going to do today is look at pathways and challenges for water, agriculture development, and food security, and then look at how can you meet those kinds of challenges through strategies and policies to address these issues. I'm going to briefly bring those strategies and policies to a short discussion on farmer-led irrigation, and then also talk briefly about what the U.S. government can do to help improve food security internationally. And going the wrong way. So the power of water in addressing food security and nutrition is that it contributes through many pathways to address these issues. Obviously, I think what many of us think of first is that irrigation contributes to increased food production and therefore farm income. That irrigation also reduces risk through improved resilience against weather variability, which is increasingly important with variability increasing under climate change. Higher food production can also reduce food prices for consumers, making food more affordable. It also helps increase agricultural diversification, particularly if you move to more precise irrigation, enhancing dietary diversity and micronutrient-rich foods, including fruits and vegetables, and also animal-source foods. The improvements in proximity and cleanliness of water sources also support women's empowerment through time savings and health gains. But it's not only the irrigation side that's important. We need a high-performing water, sanitation, and hygiene sector to also address food security and nutrition goals. Access to safe water reduces incidence of enteric infection and diseases in pregnant women. Is important for reducing maternal and neonatal mortality rates, particularly through the pathway of in-house piped water, which is something that is not that common in many regions of the developing world. An important new pathway which we should try to be opening is enhanced cooperation and integration between the agricultural water sector and the wash sector. So hunger and undernutrition are still persisting in the world today. The left-hand panel shows undernourished population. It's also considered the number of hungry people by the FAO definition. As you look at the top line there, which is the world, there's gradual improvement in reducing those after 2000, but now there's actually been a turn up. And for the last 3 years, hunger has actually increased globally, according to the FAO. You may notice also that most of that improvement is in Asia, which is in the second line there, the green line. Whereas in Africa, you've had considered static or even increasing hunger. Number of stunted children shows more dramatic progress and reductions. But again, all of that, as you can see, has been in Asia with actual increase in Africa over time. So those are warning signs. At the same time, there's increases in obesity and overweight children in the world. A lot of this is driven by increasing population and demographic shifts as well. On the left-hand side, you see the growth in population over time. As you can see, we've already crossed the equal rural and urban population point, and in the future, all the growth really is going to be in urban areas as migration continues from rural to urban areas. One of the I think somewhat scary things, if you look on the right-hand side, this shows now population growth by region between 2010 and 2100. is the huge increase in population in Africa that will be in Africa, the 2.5 billion additional people in Africa. The next largest region is 432 million in Asia. So the two regions that have the most severe hunger and nutrition issues are also where the population is going to be growing. Rising incomes, which is obviously a really good thing. You see almost a tripling of projected GDP per capita between 2000 and 2030 for the developing countries. But it also puts a lot of pressure on food demand for the future and therefore on water to produce food. We're also seeing changes in the pattern of growth in consumption. On the right-hand side, you see that particularly meats like poultry, but also dairy and oils and sugar are increasing much more rapidly than traditional staples like rice and wheat as tastes changed with urbanization and with higher incomes. Projections by IFPRI show that cereals and grains demand will increase by about 37% to 2050, meat by 66%, and fruits and vegetables as high as 85%. So very dramatic increases in higher valued commodities as compared to staples. Irrigation plays a key role in agri-food systems, of course. Less than a third of the world's harvest area is irrigated, but these areas generate 40% of global food production. And increases in irrigation in the future are going to be almost totally concentrated in developing countries, with 90% of total increase in irrigation in developing countries. Developed countries just aren't building new irrigation in general, except in small amounts. With all these trends, water stress is increasing worldwide. Currently, about 36% of the world's population is in regions that are characterized as water stressed, about almost 40% of grain production and 22% of global GDP. But if you take those numbers out to 2050, it'll be about half of population and grain production in stressed areas and close to half of global GDP as well. So the stress is going to cause more and more problems in the future. So what are the additional challenges then for water policy? There's increasing costs of developing and delivering water because the cheaper sources of water, whether groundwater or surface water, have been tapped. The relatively cheap dams have been built. And despite those increasing costs, there is wasteful use of already developed supplies, encouraged by subsidies on water and on energy that distort incentives and make it so there's not strong incentives for farmers to reduce water use. Therefore, we see depletion of groundwater, water pollution, and declining quality in many parts of the world. And that's going to be exacerbated by climate change, extreme weather, and increased variability in precipitation and stream flow. There's billions of people still without access to safe drinking water and adequate hygiene and sanitation. Water pollution, whether biological, chemical, and industrial pollutants, or fertilizer and nitrate runoffs from agriculture, are affecting human nutrition, health, economic development, and environment. They contribute to diarrhea and other diseases that make it impossible for children to process food that they are eating, so that even with relatively good levels of food production, they suffer malnourishment because of these diseases. Poor water quality also leads to increased competition among water users because the poor quality water is less productive in agriculture, and also, of course, it causes difficulties, as I just said, in the urban sector. Another key area to meet these challenges is that it's difficult to mobilize resources in this sector, and it seems to be increasingly so, both in irrigation and in WASH. In both sectors, compared to a lot of investments, there are relatively low rates of return and high financial risks. It's also difficult to estimate the increasing risk under climate change when you're projecting long-term investments such as this. It's important for public and private to work together to undertake this funding, but there remains deep suspicions between the two sectors in much of the world. The private sector sees political interference during project management, leading to, for example, water fees below sustainable levels, whereas that the government looks at the private sector and thinks they're selling water to industries rather, for example, than to agriculture users in order to reap higher rates of return. In particular, over time in the wash sector, we see underpriced services, again, as subsidies are maintained for many urban users, leading to cost recovery risk, relatively low return on investment, and so it's hard to recoup the capital-intensive investments. And the private sector is after their own profit motive, of course, whereas the unpriced public health benefits are also needed for the social sector. So there's these various kinds of difficulties in working together at that loss for the financing. There's also serious challenges in terms of what losses in value chains. And here, we see, and we've heard this number a few times in the conference, that high level, that post-harvest losses average as much as 30 to 40% worldwide. But, careful field research on value chains from farm to retail markets and beyond show much lower losses in the neighborhood of 8 to 20%, with being the highest for fruits and vegetables. But even that is enough to give significant potential to reduce food losses and the water embedded in that food. So if you could cut those by half, for example, you'd still make significant gains. But it's not the panacea that some people have been claiming from being able to save 30 or 40%. In developing countries, the issues are mainly constraints in harvesting methods and techniques, lack of storage and cooling facilities, and poor marketing and transportation systems that allow spoilage over long distances and poor roads. Of course, here in the developed world, it's mainly waste at the retail and at consumption levels in the household. So that's a pretty tough set of challenges to deal with. What about strategies and policies to address water scarcity and its impacts on food and nutrition? So I'm going to give what actually is a bit of a lightning tour of what I think are the key strategies that are needed to address water and food security. So I'll talk about water rights, technologies, incentives and subsidies, agriculture research and development, water governance, investment and finance issues, non-traditional sources of water and food like desalination, then the importance of agricultural trade policy, and movement towards more balanced diets. The first step that I think is really a cornerstone of efficient management is strong, well-defined water and also land rights. Water rights in the developing world are particularly poorly formed compared even to land rights there or compared to water rights here in the US, for example. But they're very important because they empower users by requiring consent and awarding compensation for reallocation, which is increasingly prevalent in moving water out of agriculture areas into rapidly growing urban areas, oftentimes without any compensation or discussion with the farmers involved. They also provide incentives to invest in improved technology and water management because farmers know they can retain the rights while if they invest in farm improvement or new varieties which change water flows, but they would still retain the rights anyway. The best way to do this is not through rights to absolute amounts of water, but as a perpetual right to a share of all allocations made in the river basin or the irrigation system, so you don't make the mistake of over-allocating initially based on, say, for example, a small sample of years. In each season, the share of the actual allocation should be based on available water. So there's equitable allocation of the water rights during periods of shortages. Given the wide range of rights systems around the world, I think one initiative I think that could be very good is to convene discussions to establish guidelines for water rights development, comparable to what the FAO did on their voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of tenure of land. So to develop a system to try to look at what the principles are, how do you protect informal and indigenous rights and women's rights. Obviously here we've heard all the tremendous advances in irrigation technology here, and that's going to be a key to development of productivity over time and to water security. Farmers adopt the technologies for many reasons: increased income from higher valued crops, convenience, saving labor, lowering pumping costs. They also improve nutrition in many instances because of the higher income and production diversification, empowerment of women through small-scale pumps, for example, in Africa, and through the ability to have multiple uses contributing to sanitation as well as irrigation. But I think one thing that has to be pointed out is that real system-wide water savings are much more difficult to achieve and are often limited compared to, I think, what some people think is a possibility with new technologies. For example, if you adopt a drip technology that makes your own farm much more efficient, that doesn't necessarily save water for the system as a whole. The saved water you can save water if that water would otherwise evaporate unproductively or flow to sinks, providing that system water saving. But in many cases, you may just divert water that would be used downstream by others because of the interconnectedness of the basin, shifting water use between farmers rather than generating new benefits. And a lot of studies, particularly here in the western U.S., show that Midwestern and western U.S. show increased water use when you adopt things like drip irrigation, because it increases the profitability of irrigation for individual farmers, so that rather than saving water, they actually use more water to expand their area or improve their yields. So it's a tricky issue on actual water conservation. To achieve the potential benefits through these technologies, you really need a water allocation system that recognizes those hydrological reallocations of reuse of water. And turning full circle, that comes us back to well-specified water rights that can establish a cap on use in any given river basin, and the incentives to optimize on the economic value of water. Another key step is to eliminate the generalized subsidies that you see in much of the world, and target specific goals very carefully if you're going to use subsidies at all. Around the world, you see this probably most in India is the big example, but Indonesia and Mexico and much of the rest of the world, that high subsidies on water, energy, and fertilizer have caused tremendous overuse of both water and fertilizer and substantial environmental degradation without matching gains in productivity. Instead of spending money that way, you should reduce or eliminate those broad subsidies, invest that in agriculture and water research and development, and plus compensatory income support to small farmers. I think one of the big arguments against reducing subsidies is it'll hurt small farmers, but with advances in technologies such as smart farms and smart banking, smartphones and smart banking, you can efficiently distribute direct income support to small farmers that can be effective without costing nearly as much money. And the other is to target smart subsidies to achieve specific water management goals, for example, early adoption of profitable technologies. The agricultural research is going to be, has to be increased, and the increased research for breeding, I think, could well be used, for example, in yield per unit of water and land research, including both sort of longer-term work on more efficient transpiration and photosynthesis, but also in drought and heat tolerance as well. Water resource governance also needs to be improved across the board. Strengthening the capacity of public institutions and eliminating silos and coordinating across water, agriculture, and energy ministries, for example, and improving tools for planning and monitoring in these developing country bureaucracies. At the international level, cooperation over water has been fairly effective in the form of treaties and watershed agreements. It has helped prevent conflict in areas like Mekong, the Nile, and the Indus. They aren't perfect. There should be more transparency in these involved, but just the fact that there's a formal place for the different countries to meet and discuss has been very valuable. Somewhat less valuable has been integrated water resource management within countries. Since the 1990s, it was largely been pushed top-down with very costly structures and institutions built that never quite seem to work as well as they should. In many cases, then it would be much better to look at second best solutions within localities or specific basins on how to manage across the different sectors within those basins. Similarly, top-down implementation of water user associations has generally not worked well. There's been a history, again, of governments sort of mandating water user associations or farm co-ops and doing a lot of rules, but not actually providing resources or helping them develop in ways that would actually benefit the farmers. So instead, you should devolve the water management funding to these community water managements in ways that involve directly the prospective members from the beginning and that focus very strongly on improved water delivery services and not just farmer obligations such as fee payments, which seem to be the main concern of many of these top-down associations. There does also need to be increased investment in irrigation, but particularly in the wash sector. Work at IFPRI estimates that over the next, or through 2050, the required irrigation investment in the developing world is on the order of $8 to $12 billion per year. And that's less than in recent decades, as in generally, again, as many of the best sites for irrigation have been used up, and many of them are extremely expensive now. But that's dwarfed by the estimated requirements for water treatment and sewage disposal plants. The WHO assessed that global access to improved water and sanitation services would cost $27 billion per year through 2030. And if you added to that global access to regulated in-house piped water supply, numbers are in the neighborhood of $170 to $200 billion a year for that. So obviously, to go along, if you're going to spend that kind of money or even begin to move towards those kind of goals, you need to improve the current financing and planning mechanisms in these areas. There's unmet potential still for looking at things like green and blue bonds for the water sector, payments for ecosystem services, which a number of people have mentioned in the meeting here, and also blended public and private finance where governments issue guarantees or there's matching of funding. So again, that has to get past that kind of mutual suspicion between the public and private sector. You also need to do things to make water and sanitation more of a business proposition, implementing graduated water pricing policies, allowing poor consumers still access to clean water at low or even no prices in some instances, but then to charge enough to better off consumers to make urban systems economically viable. Water pollution is a really tough one to handle. There's already good regulations in the books in many countries, but there hasn't been as much enforcement as there should be. One way to go would be to start by prioritizing major polluters in the specific water bodies with the highest pollution and the largest potential adverse impact on nutrition and health, and go after those with a combination of regulations and economic incentives or taxes. Value chains, I said that the potential may be not quite as high as some people think, but again, there's potential that should be tapped there. That's going to require investments in rural infrastructure, again, with public and private partnerships. But there's also new technologies that are going to make it possible to do better in this area of reducing post-harvest losses. Sensors are revolutionizing value chains by tracking food from source to final use and monitoring quality throughout the chain so that farmers can get credit for higher quality, and you can also track potential risks of spoilage along the way. So through these methods, through hard investment plus technologies, you can reduce food and loss waste, reducing therefore, of course, water use as well in greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of interest in what I'm calling non-traditional sources of food and water, though of course these have been around now for quite a while. The best survey of urban irrigation shows that there's about 24 million hectares of area in urban areas over 50,000 population, or at least 50,000. So there is potential there, obviously. 11% of all irrigated croplands is a substantial area. And if you had actually more recognition from the government and with some regulation of those, you might be able to expand that. But I think there's also, you have to have a lot of caution in terms of how much more you can get out of urban agriculture. That most of it is temporary. It pops up where there's land still available as you're expanding investments in apartments or whatever, but left some land behind, but then they often disappear quickly. And there's also a lot of health risks from drainage runoff and raw sewage, and lead and contaminants in soils and in air also constrain the demand for these. So again, I think it's an important niche, but may not be a huge source of growth from where it is now. If you look at the potential for using treated wastewater, you start with the numbers that municipal water demand is about 11% of global water withdrawals, of which only 3% is consumed, and then 8% is discharged as wastewater. So you do get about a potential of 8% there. With the best analyses I've seen, the clean treated wastewater could be expanded to at least to the areas that are now currently treated with raw and diluted wastewater. So again, here, about 5 to 20 million hectares of potential areas to be treated by clean wastewater. Again, a good increment, but not game-changing. Large-scale wastewater recycling plants is tend to be energy-intensive and also produce sludge that is difficult to dispose. There are newer technologies and some very interesting work going on at EME and elsewhere on developing new sludge byproducts that are useful. And there's other work on recycling at net zero energy cost by capturing biogas. Right now, I'd say it's fairly modest, but again, has the potential here to grow faster with good technological change. Desalination, it's grown a lot, but it still provides around 1% of the world's drinking water. Various studies show that it could increase to 5% of total water demand by, say, 2100, but still concentrating on coasts, including North Africa and Middle East, and places like Singapore, which can afford it. So you still need to reduce costs and energy intensity and harmful byproducts. Again, desalination is going to be very helpful where it's cost effective, but it's not it's not a great, large substitute for developing and managing fresh water. Another area that's not normally thought of as part of the water equation is that we need to work to reduce international agricultural trade and macroeconomic distortions. And we're in a period now where, not just in the US, but in many parts of the world, higher trade barriers are being erected, and that's going to cause significant problems for food security in the future. We really need to support open trading regimes that will share climate risk and promote the effective use of virtual water or the water embedded in food. And this is going to be increasingly important as climate change increases the reliance of many developing countries on food imports. A lot of work that we've done and others have done show that even with, say, rapid growth in places in Africa and South Asia, they're still going to require even greater imports of food because demand will outpace the production growth. It's also going to be important to address the short-term food shortages. We see more and more weather-induced production shocks globally. And if trade is not there, then those shocks are going to be transmitted directly to reduced consumption of the poor and harm to nutrition and health. A final area is in dietary change. And here it would be valuable to promote balanced diets both for health and sustainability, including reduced water use. Schools, corporations, and health and nutrition campaigns can work together, I think, to make effective changes in diets that would that would be more water saving. In places like the US and Europe, it probably is a good idea to reduce beef consumption on the margin, but it's also a very important thing to note is that in much of the developing world, it's going to be very important to increase consumption of beef. Protein and micronutrients from beef and other livestock sourced foods is one of the best sources for these in places like Africa, where you may only eat a kilo or two a year. So it's a very big, diverse picture on the future demand depending on what you're looking at. What about farmer-led irrigation? That's been a big theme here in this conference. Large-scale irrigation faces a lot of challenges. Let's focus particularly on sub-Saharan Africa. It's very high cost, not only in the development of the infrastructure for the dams and canals, but in developing large-scale rural roads, rail and markets to very remote areas. So, given this small scale irrigation looks much more promising. It's spurred by recent technological developments. It can be deployed at much lower cost than large scale. It's flexible for a diverse farming system and also changing hydrology. As climate change proceeds and rivers change course and rainfall changes patterns, these flexible new pumps can be moved along with that. You can't just pick up a dam and move that. They contribute also to women's empowerment and are overall more environmentally benign, though you have to keep an eye on that because, for example, solar-powered irrigation could drive down water tables if the governance systems aren't in place. To promote farmer-led irrigation, you need technological innovations, and we're seeing that already in the small-scale pumps, but also digitization and remote sensing tools for water resources management and monitoring could play a role, and of course solar panels with institutions to manage the pollution. The institutional innovations are going to be very important also, and go back here to needing stronger water rights so that the farmers are protected as they embark on new technologies, and also the smallholder associations or water user associations that are inclusive of women will be very important in developing the localized governance systems for these. Supporting infrastructure conditions, again, the general subsidies on energy that are prevalent should be reduced or removed. Instead, target subsidies directly to early adopters of profitable irrigation, provide better road and market access, and also, of course, there's the whole package of credit, insurance, extension, and complementary inputs. It have to be noted, to the extent that these are provided initially by governments or at reduced prices, that the key to all of these technologies is eventually they're going to need to be profitable without a lot of subsidies. And to scale up these technologies are really going to require highly profitable technologies relatively soon. Most of these are still at early stages and aren't showing yet the profitability levels to be scaled up in large measure. They are showing significant progress, but that has to be managed very carefully. Overall, of course, I took a very high level on strategy and policies here, but any kind of policy, institution, or management reform, whether it's on small scale irrigation or the other aspects that I've discussed here so far, obviously have to be tailored to levels of development, both institutional capabilities and governance capabilities of different countries, the agroclimatic conditions, relative water scarcity, current levels of intensification, and degree of water competition. So these will play out differently and will have different priorities depending on depending on these underlying conditions. But the solutions obviously are difficult and will take time, political commitment, and money. And to move forward, move forward very quickly because of the growing challenges. And let me just say a few things about what the U.S. government then could do to promote improved international outcomes on food and water security. One is to strengthen the environment for cooperation and communication in the U.S. government between water development and WASH and food and nutrition security. And I was excited to hear Rob Bertram say yesterday that they're already moving to link the Water for the World Act closely with the Feed the Future initiative and bring water much more comprehensively in a coordinated basin under the same roof within USAID, which could have very high payoffs. We need to ease a challenge that hinder greater private sector investment to expand sustainable water. And here I think there needs to be more use of levers in the government in addition to USAID, including expanding investments by USDA and the new Development Finance Corporation on areas of water and food security in developing nations. And also then, I think even maybe more important than spending more money is to leverage US expertise and influence to improve water resource governance and sustainability. Let's bring to bear the technical expertise and educational opportunities available in this country even much more widely. We see the great evidence of educational opportunities here at Nebraska, but that needs to be done and sort of revitalized much more nationwide. And the other area is to strengthen, support, and significantly increase agriculture research and development and interdisciplinary research at the nexus of water, food, and nutrition. We heard yesterday that the agricultural R&D public spending has really stagnated compared to other aspects of R&D, and given the incredible payoff of agricultural R&D, that's really not the way it should be going. Particularly as you expand those resources, you should use the great expertise here at land-grant institutions and other educational opportunities to enhance research and development of the kind of solutions that I discussed and have been discussed throughout this meeting. Thank you. Guess I take questions now. Let's see, anybody have questions?
This is Pasquale Steduto. Mark, I saw in one of your graphs, when talking about the changing diet, one of the drivers is the change in income and the positive trend of the increase in GDP. Even if there was a gap between developing and developed, but still the trend is in a positive increase. This gives the idea, or at least the perception, that things are getting better from the income perspective. But I have also all this concern about inequality and distribution of that wealth. How that type of challenges would affect a little bit now this food and water security? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great point, Pasquale. And it is true that a lot of that growth is at middle income and above. So there's growing, as we saw, growing demand for higher valued food and stuff, along with growing obesity among those classes, while others are being left behind in that growth process. And because of that, in addition to these kind of water and direct agricultural policies, I think there has to be much more investment in social policies and social safety nets to try to first keep people above poverty and extreme hunger levels, but then to also help them graduate beyond that. And that's going to take a lot more commitment than we've seen from many of the governments worldwide right now. But that was an extremely good point to raise. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering, there was a point in your delivery that said about eliminating subsidies and also targets. A lot of the corporate world has set their aim to, goals around 2025, 2030, and others. And some of them might actually have embraced this notion of the science-based target, initially on carbon, but now more recently trying to take those same ideas into water, including the context-based notion of things. it seems like many companies could mobilize resources in that direction, but it seems like the scale and speed won't be enough to meet the challenge. So I was wondering if you had any just general advice on those kind of science-based targets trends.
Yeah, that's another great question. It's a really hard one. I think we saw earlier in some talks here that we're doing very poorly in terms of trying, for example, to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. We aren't even going in the right direction on hunger. It's increasing instead of declining. Yeah, I think, the private sector has moved in very positive ways, but as you say, in many cases, they're not investing enough. And at the same time, I think the governments aren't providing the right frameworks that can move us in those directions. The broad-based investment in public goods like roads and rural infrastructure or electrification, together with targeting highly productive alternative technologies rather than just spreading large subsidies that aren't productive. So I think that's why we have to restructure the approach by both the government and hopefully to get additional investment from the private sector as well.
This was a really excellent presentation, as all of your presentations are. You've spent a fairly long career now doing really outstanding research to provide the evidence for providing policy advice, investment advice, and so on in water and food security. So my question is, looking back over all of this, does our research make a difference? I ask that because some of what you've recommended is not new. You're repeating things that we've all been repeating for some time. So is there something we should be doing differently in order to make our research more effective and really have an impact?
Yeah, I think certainly, it's very well documented that agricultural research and development, such as crop breeding, does have very high payoffs. So I think there's no question about that. It's been more difficult to show measurable benefits from social science research, such as I do, and even engineering research in many cases. I think partly, how should I phrase this? I think it's that what we do is having small impacts globally, and that we do have successes here and there. There's some work I did in Indonesia that had made positive changes in fertilizer subsidies that turned out to be beneficial. Work we did in climate change and trade in the Philippines has helped move to a better trade policy there. So there are things that, and probably each one of us could cite those kinds of effects, but I think it's been very hard for us to keep up with the huge challenges that we see out there, especially when just efforts on helping the poor, as the previous speaker talked about, and having broad-based enough investments to get a critical mass to move forward. But it's a very tough question. I think we're doing good, and we can cite those, and we can see improvements, for example. Well, here's an improvement. We saw that today that crop yields in Nebraska have doubled without water use increasing at all. So there are those kinds of breakthroughs, and I think we need to extend those more effectively into social science areas as well.
Well, thanks for our presentation. We talk about developing technology, bringing infrastructure, and possibly making possible to produce foods in places that we are not used to produce. So that, of course, creates opportunity for local people to produce. However, this also creates opportunity for a big investor for land grabs, especially in the global south. So how to counterbalance those two strong forces, like people in need for their food, for their subsistence, in face of larger interests on taking advantage of the infrastructure that we create, that we, as scientists, we make things possible, but someone will take advantage in a unfair way. So how to combat that? Thank you.
I think that's where the idea of rights is the most powerful. That the existing pre-existing rights of local peoples are recognized, and that they are able to be part of the negotiation with the, like you said, the rich corporations. In the early periods of those land grabs, particularly, governments were basically, many of the governments were saying, well, there's no real rights to these lands. But in fact, there'd be long-term traditional rights to farm those areas, but through, from local communities and inhabitants. And I think there was enough of a backlash against that those kinds of, the worst kinds of those land grabs were stopped. And that's when FAO helped develop the guidelines for land governance of land rights in those kind of cases and others. And so they've been a little more effective that way, but that's the kind of thing that has to be watched at all times. And I think and I think water rights is even less well developed there. So that's why I put that kind of very high on my list as a priority. So thank you.
Hi, so I had a question about U.S. Food aid. Every year in Ethiopia, there are millions of people who are in need of food. And every year, the response seems to be that there's a temporary fix of supplying food from U.S. or from U.K. or from Australia or from Canada. When will that policy change to supporting farmers in that country to produce food? There are parts of Ethiopia which is rich in rainfall, and mostly the agriculture in Ethiopia is rain-fed. When will the policy change, and what are the obstacles to that?
Well, there's other people in this audience probably a lot better qualified than me to answer that, but let me just say a few things there. That I think what happens is there's really two strands of policy, not only in the U.S. and other countries. There's the development assistance that does try to do what you're saying in terms of improving the ability of farmers to grow more food and to improve markets and value chains. But parallel with that is the food aid track. And I think there's definitely a role for food aid and the work that the World Food Program is doing. But over time, the investment levels have shifted too far from the development to those kind of food aid based on food shocks, so that while we're addressing the immediate problem of hunger or malnutrition, we're not providing enough of the foundation for agriculture and economic development to reach the states where you don't need to do that so much. So I think there has to be a balancing back to development, but of course you don't also want to ignore serious drought or famine shocks as well. But as you said, more on the development side it would be better and should be a priority.
We have time for one more question. Please. Jesse, we have a question in the upper corner there.
Thank you. It's a tremendous closing lecture to this, Mark. You mentioned the private sector, and I just wonder if you elaborate just a little bit more on, do you feel like some of the large, visible consumer-facing companies, which have not gotten involved in policy with some small exceptions, are they able to, in your view, move the needle to affect public opinion and therefore policymakers to really make a difference? And I know a lot of them would hope to do so. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think they do, and there's already been movement, positive movement in those areas where when they do sustainable sourcing of the ingredients for their foods, they can basically move entire supply chains more rapidly than any sort of government regulation or tax could do. So I think to the extent that major corporations were willing to go even deeper into sustainable sourcing, but into nutrition-oriented initiatives, I think they can make a huge difference. Probably more in the developed world right now, because the corporations don't have quite the same leverage. Though even in developing countries, you're seeing the big supermarket chains helping to improve quality through contract farming and through quality controls that farmers then grow to specific qualities so that they can meet those and get higher prices and incomes. So yeah, even in the developing world as well, and even more so here, I think the private companies could be a huge force for the good and are already making steps that way.
Would you please join me in thanking Mark? Thank you. Thank you. Here is
Oh, cool.
the Heuermann medallion.
Great. Medallion, thanks. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks very much.
I would like to again thank you for joining us today. Mark, thanks for those insightful comments. It's clear to me that we have real challenges, wicked grand challenges, the sustainable development goals. Time is short. It feels like we need to move incremental change versus dramatic positive change here in the next decade to 3 decades. And so thank you for your thought-provoking comments. Thank you again to all the folks who came. Again, 350 participants from 15 countries converging here in Lincoln to think about food and water security and the linkages to a resilient planet. And on that note, for those of you here in Nebraska or around the globe, next year's Heuermann Lecture Series will focus on resilience. And all 3 of our talks next year are lined up, so we're excited about that.